Will you care to remark further on the bill as amended? Representative Sampson.
Good afternoon, Madam Speaker.
Good afternoon, sir.
So, as was just mentioned, we are now speaking on the amended bill, which was a strike all, so the amendment essentially became the bill. The first couple of sections kind of lay out the definitions that are used throughout the language of the bill, and also the kind of notion of the fact that we're creating a construct of regulations to regulate the transportation network company industry. So I'll start with a couple of questions to my good friend who is the chairman of the insurance committee, regarding those first couple of sections. So
please proceed, sir.
Thank you. So in, I think, the beginning of Section 2, it talks about the registration of transportation network companies. And I'm hoping that the chairman could describe for me exactly the process by which a transportation network company becomes registered in the state of Connecticut. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker. The process is simply that the TNC company or a potential TNC company would have to go to the Department of Transportation, fill out a form that the commissioner has created, and then pay an initial fee of $50,000 to register their TNC, and that fee becomes a $5,000 fee annually every year after that they continue to operate in the state of Connecticut. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the chairman for that answer. So I guess I have a broader question, which is what exactly are we regulating in this language in the bill? Because I noticed that there is language about transportation network companies and also taxi cabs, but it seems to me that those industries are treated very differently within this bill and there are separate sections. So to the chairman, through you, Madam Speaker, what exactly is this bill intended to regulate, and are we treating these industries the same? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
In this specific instance, in Section 2, what we're trying to accomplish is the fact that since 2014, both of these companies have been operating completely unregulated in the state of Connecticut. And right now, the business model that Uber and Lyft have is they show up in a municipality or a state, they start to operate, and they are completely unregulated. So under this specific section, Section 2, all we're trying to accomplish is that the company that is a TNC, whether it's Uber, Lyft, or Sean Scanlon TNC company, has to go to the Department of Transportation, fill out a form, register with the state, pay a fee to enter the market, and go about their business as a TNC company. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I appreciate the description, although it's pretty clear from that we are attempting to regulate transportation network companies, or TNCs. I think I'll start using that term. It might be a little easier. In a way that is different from taxi cabs. So a couple of further questions about this regulation process. Are we only concerned with rides that happen within the confines of the state of Connecticut? And if that's the case, is there any regulation that extends beyond Connecticut in the bill before us? For example, if someone is picked up for a ride in maybe northern Connecticut by the Mass border, but their destination is in Massachusetts, would this regulation apply in that case? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, I believe there's nothing in the bill specifically laying out what happens when a TNC crosses state lines, but I believe that other states, like Massachusetts, for example, that the representative gave, do have their own laws governing how TNCs operate. But while the driver and the passenger were together in the state of Connecticut, these laws in this amendment would apply. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I heard the chairman mention that the fee for the initial registration to become a registered TNC in Connecticut is $50,000. And I just find that a little shocking. I don't think there's many industries that we would charge so much for someone to become a registered business within our state. And I'm hoping he can speak to why that amount is so significant. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, this is the amount that represents an agreement between the two major TNC companies that exist in our state today that we believe feel is appropriate for them to pay, given the fact that they are today paying absolutely nothing towards operating in our state. And this would allow the DOT to perform various functions at the staff level through the support of a fee such as this. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I don't want to debate whether or not they're paying anything. It's a separate issue, but I would say they most certainly are paying corporate income tax for the money that they generate in the state. It also says on line 57 that the registration form and fee, once submitted, the fee is non-refundable. So through you, Madam Speaker, does that mean that if someone applied, they could be denied and still have to pay $50,000? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, there's nothing that states that directly.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would just suggest that on line 57, it does indeed use the word non-refundable registration fee of $50,000. So if the chairman could explain to me what that language means. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, it means it's a non-refundable fee. Through you.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I appreciate that, except I don't want to beat a dead horse, but it seems to me that that means you could apply and be denied and still pay $50,000. I hope he'll correct me if I'm wrong. The larger point about this fee, I think, is that a $50,000 fee to enter a certain type of business might preclude other entrepreneurs from trying to get in and become competitors. Do you see, through you, Madam Speaker, that a $50,000 fee might become a barrier to entry into that marketplace?
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, we have no idea to this point how many rides or drivers either of these two large TNC companies have in this state. But I have seen numbers that they have shared or have come out in other states across the country. Both of these companies are doing incredibly well, as are, I believe, any person who enters a market, frankly, that is something people need on a daily basis. People need to get around, they need to go to work, they need to go pick up their kids, they need to go to dinner with their friends. There's always going to be a market for transportation in our state, and I believe that it is not a barrier to entry. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would say that every word that we put into our laws is a policy decision, and this is no different. To state that we are going to require someone to enter this industry must pay a $50,000 potentially non-refundable entrance fee stands out to me as something that sends a message that we are inviting the two large players that can come into our state and pay this fee, but maybe the small guy, maybe Sean Scanlon TNC Company, maybe doesn't have $50,000 hanging around to go ahead and start his company. And it also is going to mean that the only way you could survive as a TNC company would be that you have a sizable market share. I think that's a dangerous precedent, and I'll just leave it at that and move on. So, Madam Speaker, in Section 3 of the bill, there's some a couple of paragraphs about the requirements of TNC company riders and drivers. And I notice in the very beginning of Section 3, it says that after a rider submits a request for a prearranged ride, the company is going to display to that rider the driver that would pick them up, a photograph. And I just have a couple of questions about this. How does the TNC obtain that photograph, and how are we to know that that is a current photograph of that driver? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, when an individual applies to become a TNC driver, he or she has to provide certain information to the TNC company. One of the things that these companies require, and we require under this bill, is to provide a photograph of yourself. As for whether or not there's anything in here requiring that it has to be the most up-to-date photograph, there is nothing that does that. However, I would say that on all these platforms, whether it's Uber, Lyft, anybody else, there is a strong incentive for folks to give feedback in terms of rating their driver and the experience that they had. I believe that if someone was to get into an Uber and the picture was of Representative Sampson and they thought it was supposed to be of me, they may note that to the company, and the company would then promptly investigate that, determine what's going on, and if it was found that somebody was driving using somebody else's partner app, I believe that they would be immediately dismissed from the rideshare platform. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate the answer, although I think that the decision that they would be immediately dismissed is a policy decision that they would have to make on their own. I don't think that we've included that in the bill before us. I have a couple of questions about this picture situation, and I will just ask them all, and I will hope that the chairman can answer at least some of them. The first question is, how does the TNC company know that is in fact a photo of the actual person that they have subcontracted to be a driver? I'll ask them all in consideration of trying to not take up a lot of time. The next one is, how does the rider know that that is indeed the actual person that's going to pick them up? And what happens if that's not the person? They're shown a picture and then someone else arrives and it's not that person. Is there a mechanism to preclude someone else using that person's account? So in other words, I have on my phone an app that belongs to someone else, and I could go and pick up that person. Is there a mechanism to protect against that? And ultimately, all these questions have one concern in common, and that is, I believe it is incumbent upon us in this body to make sure that we are protecting consumers, and that includes both the drivers, who may or may not be in danger based on who they pick up, and the riders based on who might meet them at a destination or at a pickup location. Through you, Madam Speaker, if the chairman can answer any of those questions, I'd appreciate it.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, I'll start with the representative's second question. Why we, under this bill, ask that the driver have a photograph and their license plate depicted on the app itself is for the exact reason that Representative Sampson is talking about. If we had somebody who was calling up an Uber to come to pick me up at the state capitol right now, and I see that the person is going to be in a 2017 Ford Fusion, they are a middle-aged woman, and the license plate is XYZ, the person comes up, they have an Uber sticker, it's a young man with a different license plate and a completely different car, we are entrusting the consumer to have enough judgment not to then get into that, given all of the upfront information we're giving them under this bill, which is the picture of what the driver is allegedly going to look like, their license plate, and the make and model of their car. We chose not to legislate the intent or judgment of people here. I think that would have been very difficult to do. And instead, we put out a clear rubric that we believe if people follow and use their best judgment, they will be safer. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate the answers to the questions, although I have to admit I find the response to be lacking in something that satisfies me as far as protection for consumers and drivers. We already regulate the livery and taxicab industry pretty heavily for exactly those purposes. Significant requirements both for drivers, for background checks, which we'll talk about, and for identification on the vehicles, and I will get to that in a moment too about the identification on TNC vehicles. But to me, these requirements here are pretty limited. There are 100 scenarios that one could come up with that might be dangerous to one or both parties based on the lack of direct knowledge of the image of that person and the use of the app or account by another person. So I'll get to that next thing, which is that in Section 3, subsection 2, it talks about the requirement to have a decal on the vehicle at all times when you are operating as a TNC driver. But I don't know that there's any mechanism for compliance. Is there any way to know, can law enforcement know that someone is operating as a TNC driver from the outside looking in, like they can tell a taxi cab? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, there is nothing that specifically in this section allows law enforcement to do that. but elsewhere in the bill, DOT is permissible to audit the company up to 4 times a year and see exactly who is driving for them and what's going on, and they could then cross-check the information. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And again, I thank the chairman of the Insurance Committee for his answer. Again, the ability to audit after the fact is not the same thing as law enforcement's ability to know on the spot, visually, to know whether someone is complying with that law like they would have to in a taxi cab industry. There's also a requirement a little further down in Section 3 that the TNC company has to provide information about their rides and what has been picked up and receipts within a reasonable amount of time. Just out of curiosity, through you, Madam Speaker, what is determined to be reasonable in that case?
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, that is obviously a very subjective definition, though I would say, again, as I've tried to answer many of the representatives' questions, these are businesses. These are businesses that, like any business in the state of Connecticut, has to give good customer service in order to keep business. And so in the case of many of these platforms, you're getting it immediately to your email. I won't say that every single platform that's going to become a TNC in the state will actually do that. But I would say that if people feel like it's not getting to them in a reasonable period of time, they can, as I said, with the driver and the image, the license plate, there is a mechanism for the customer to give feedback about the ride that they just had. And if they feel like they didn't get a receipt or if they didn't get it in a reasonable period of time, there is a way that they can lodge a complaint against the company and try to make their voice heard in that instance. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And again, I thank the chairman. The only thing I would say about that is that we are doing a few different things in this bill. We are certainly regulating the TNC companies themselves, but this is an industry where consumers are directly impacted, and we have chosen in the past in similar industries to regulate them heavily for protection of consumers. And I see that there are some holes here because the TNC company itself is just a data company. They are putting people together, whereas there are independent contractors, average citizens, like the two of us talking here, involved. And obviously people vary in their trustworthiness. There are some mechanisms in the bill to provide for consumer protection with background checks and so forth. And as I said, we'll talk about that a little bit. But some of these things that I've mentioned are places where there are vast differences between what we have chosen as regulation in the past to be sufficient and what we're allowing in this bill. So there's in line 96, it also makes it clear that the TNC may charge a fare. And I found that interesting because I don't know why we would indicate only a may in this instance, and why would we bother to include it in the bill? I won't even ask a question about it, though. Speaking of payment, on line 109 through 110, it makes it clear that no TNC company driver can accept a cash payment. Now, I understand the intent of that language is probably to prevent TNC drivers from carrying large amounts of cash and become potential targets for a crime. However, I don't know if that's a legal thing to do. Our money says very clearly on it that it is just payment for all debts, public and or private. And I know that courts across the country have litigated on this in the past and found that cash is an acceptable form of payment in all cases whatsoever. So I have some concern about this. And a further question about that is whether or not it is some sort of discrimination to say you must have a credit card to be able to use a TNC by virtue of the fact that they will not accept cash. A little further down in subsection 4A, a mention is made of dynamic pricing. Through you, Madam Speaker, would the good chairman explain to me what dynamic pricing is?
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, dynamic pricing is essentially the classic example of supply and demand. If there are more folks that are asking for service, the service itself can raise the price for that service. That's all well and good. That's a big component of what the TNCs do as a business model. All we're saying in this bill, to pre-butt what the representative might ask me next, is that in certain situations, we want to make sure that the dynamic pricing is not interfering with public safety, and that is why we capped it at 2.5 times the normal dynamic pricing charge that is allowed under the Uber. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I appreciate that answer from the good chairman. I sometimes get a little clairvoyant when I'm up here asking some questions also. So I was going to get to that, and I promise that I will. The one thing I would point out about the dynamic pricing piece, however, that people should understand is that this is vastly different than how we treat taxi cabs. In those cases, it is the commissioner of the Department of Transportation who dictates what the pricing will be that they can charge. In this case, the TNC company gets to determine whatever their rates are at any time through this mechanism of dynamic pricing. A noteworthy difference. So just to follow up on that piece that the chairman referenced about price gouging, we've had some offline conversations about this, and what this bill says is that in no instance shall a TNC company increase their rate more than this 2.5 times figure in cases of emergency. And I understand the purpose of this. You do not want people charging exorbitant amounts if they are in a position to possibly rescue someone from a dangerous catastrophe somewhere. However, I would say that this is a very dangerous thing to do because we are, in essence, regulating a private industry to tell them what they can charge for things, and it might have the exact opposite effect. If someone is in a position to take a great risk to themselves to save someone else's life, and they might be inclined to do that for a significant sum, and some person who might be in that much danger would be willing to pay it, I think it is dangerous for us to say, no, you can only charge 2.5 times. You may, in fact, be telling people not to go rescue those people. And I just think that's something we ought to be careful of going forward. Speaking of choice in how people operate their business, it says early on in this bill that people that drive as drivers for TNC companies are not employees. They are independent contractors. Yet in subsection little c of section 3, it says that a transportation network company shall adopt a policy of non-discrimination, which I appreciate, except that there's a word in the list of things that we shall not discriminate against, which is not by any means a protected class. Certainly, people should be protected for age and race and religion and so forth, but the word destination appears in here. And I think that this is included in this bill in deference to the taxi industry because they cannot turn down fares. They have to go wherever they are called to. And in the case of TNCs, I think we are trying to make the same requirement of them. Through you, Madam Speaker, is that the intent of this language, to say that TNC drivers must go to fares regardless of their destination? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, that is correct, and that is the intent of this section. Through you.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate that answer, and I have some significant reservations with it, which I want to talk about. But the first thing I would say is, how is that possible? Maybe the chairman can describe for me exactly how the process works. I've never used Uber personally myself as a rider or a driver, so I don't really know. At what point does the driver accept the potential rider? Do they know in advance where that person is to be picked up and what their destination is? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, when this is all over, I'll offer Representative Sampson, we'll take an Uber somewhere together and hopefully celebrate passage of this bill. Until that moment, though, I would say that yes, the driver does see on their phone where an individual is requesting the ride from and where they are often going to go. So if I was to pull up my Uber app right now and say that I was at 300 Capitol Avenue, then I would put in where I wanted to go. They would show up and see where I wanted to go and then accept or decline the ride.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So in effect, the actual Uber driver can very easily discriminate against what rides he wants to accept and which ones he or she may not, based on that destination, because they're going to know in advance. The question I have, is there any mechanism at all to prohibit them from using that choice? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, I don't know if the companies following this passage of this law will update their software to disallow that. What I do know, though, is that in the case of my personal experience using Uber, if you are rejected, similar to what we've been talking about throughout this afternoon, you have the ability to go on and comment as to why that was. And so if somebody feels like they are being discriminated against, they can go on and report that driver and allege that they feel that the dismissal or the cancellation of the driver coming to pick them up had something to do with discrimination, and the company would then look into that, as I'm sure they would in all the other instances we've talked about. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the chairman for his answer. I tend to doubt that unless there's a requirement in the law that anybody is going to do anything to prohibit this practice from occurring. Personally, I'm thankful about that, because I can imagine that there are many TNC drivers that are not, I wouldn't say as qualified drivers, but maybe qualified to handle difficult situations as maybe a professional cab driver who has a suitable license and experience and training to go ahead and pick up and carry passengers, even in known dangerous neighborhoods, that kind of thing. You can imagine, a young college-age person being asked to go into a very bad location and potentially be in danger, and why they might make a decision to not go. And I understand that we have made this requirement in the law, but we have done nothing here to enforce it whatsoever. So it's kind of, we're on one hand saying in the law that we're about to pass or not, that this is a requirement, that no one can possibly ever discriminate against someone based on their destination, but we are also essentially allowing it because we're not putting any protection or penalty for not doing it. And I think that's disingenuous, especially when this is something that I think is very important to the taxi industry, because that is a major distinct difference between their business model and this. And we are one state regulating what I see as one basic industry and setting up two distinct regulatory constructs. Okay, so on to the next bit, which is about record keeping. So further down in that section, it's little e1, it says that the TNC company has to maintain a bunch of records, and I don't want to waste everybody's time talking about that. I just noticed that there's nothing in there that says that the drivers themselves have to keep records. And I'm curious to why that is, because in this bill, we are essentially saying that TNC is a data company, but it is the driver who is the subcontractor who's essentially responsible for the lion's share of what's happening here, which is that transport. Through you, Madam Speaker, is there anything in this legislation that requires the driver to keep records of his pickups and who he transports and to where?
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, no, there is not. And the reason for that is because in this TNC model, the driver is not keeping track of any of the information. They're also not keeping track of any of the money. That's what they believe is the difference in this model versus perhaps the cab industry. So the driver doesn't have to keep records of this because all the data is electronically stored by the TNC company. And that's the kind of data that I think Representative Sampson is asking about, where they go, how many fares they do in a day. All of that is maintained in the cloud, I would assume, through the company's TNC database. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yeah, I noticed that in the following section, there is an audit process that the Commissioner of Transportation can go through. And what is interesting here is it says that the Commissioner shall not require the TNC to disclose information identifying the riders or drivers unless. the identity of the driver riders needed to resolve a complaint or investigate. I would say those are pretty broad terms. I think that people have a natural notion that their privacy is a little bit more secure than that, about their whereabouts and so forth when they use a transportation network company. And for a mere complaint, which may have no basis for it to have that information released, I see as problematic and something I wish I had the opportunity to talk about with the chairman before this bill became before us today. I would note, just for the record, there was some conversation earlier about how this came before us, and I don't want to belabor the point, but you notice that I am the ranking member of the Insurance Committee, and I'm speaking at great length with the chairman of the Insurance Committee about a bill that has very little to do with insurance. There is a small section that is devoted to that, but this is in large measure a transportation bill, and the fact that it did not go before the Transportation Committee shocks me. It's also a bill that creates new laws, new penalties, things that would normally require a bill to go to the Judiciary Committee. It also deals with money. It has fines and fees associated with it, which you would assume would send it to one of the money committees. You could even make a good case that it might go to public safety. So for us to be debating this, I find interesting. It's also worth noting that this language that's before us never received a hearing from the public, and that while this version is only slightly changed from the previous version of the bill that I looked at, I didn't see any substantial version of this bill that looks like this until late yesterday. And it's a very difficult thing to be able to walk into a negotiation about what laws we should pass at the last minute and play an important role in how that's crafted. And I just would state for the record, I think it's unfortunate. We should, in the future, try and work together more closely so that we don't have to fine-tune so many things here at the last minute. We could have that done in advance. So, continuing on the notion of privacy, if you go to line 200 in the bill, which is just a little bit further down, it says that the TNC shall not disclose the rider's personally identifiable information without the rider's consent. And I just have a question about how that would be or is obtained from the rider. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, if the good ranking member would cite the line number of what he's asking, I would appreciate it. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Sampson, do you have a line number?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yes, indeed. It is between lines 200 and 206, section little f.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, I believe what the representative is asking is what is the process or why they would have the rider's consent. As we talked about a few minutes ago, the DOT has the opportunity to audit 4 times a year information about this. There is protections about who they can do and where that information can then be shared. In this instance, I believe if an appropriate state agency, law enforcement, was conducting a investigation of something had to do with an Uber ride, they would then have the ability to contact the driver, or I'm sorry, the rider, and ask their permission. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As I'm reading it, I think that this section conflicts directly with the previous section we talked about, which essentially says they can provide the information under certain circumstances. And this one says they must obtain consent. I don't know if those things have to go hand in hand or not. But my question was more specific than that. It's very simple. How do they obtain this consent? It says written consent. Would that mean that a user of the electronic digital application could do it through that mechanism, or they actually have to sign a document in writing? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, I can find out the answer to that question and get back to the representative about it. Through you.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate that, and that is something that we do in the committee process, but I'm left here, so hopefully maybe by the end of this debate we'll have an answer to that question. I think it's very important because, you know, I'm sure everyone in this room gets pop-ups on their computer or in their telephone all the time when they're using electronic software that says, you know, you got to sign this, check this box, and hit yes to continue, but no one's really reading all that, and that's unfortunate. I think that's something that I wish I was in a place to fix, but I'm not. But in this case, I'd like to make certain that people understand that if they're going to use this application, if that is a possibility, whether or not they could be giving up their personal identifiable information about their geolocation data and when and where they go based on just checking off a box or clicking something on an application. All right, so right after that, the bill states that no TNC driver can use the digital network or provide prearranged rides for more than 14 hours consecutively or 16 hours in a 24-hour period. I'm curious if the chairman knows how this compares to the taxi industry or any other industry for that matter, truck drivers, so on. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, I do not have that information in front of me. Through you.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yes, this is another situation where if I had a little more notice, I would have been keen on looking it up myself to find out whether we are trying to keep this same or making an exception. And again, we don't know, so we'll have to just move on from there. The very next section says that the Commissioner of Motor Vehicles will not require a TNC driver to have a commercial driver's license. Are TNC drivers required to have any kind of special license at all? Can they just have a regular private passenger driver's license, or do they need to have a passenger endorsement, or do they need to have anything beyond that? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, they do not. They need the same license that I'm sure most of us use every single day if we're not in a job that requires us to have a specialized license. Through you.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Again, this goes back to my earlier point about how we are essentially creating a dichotomy here between the taxi industry and this, the TNC companies, because we are saying in one case you must go through this extra hoop to ensure that you are properly prepared and trained to carry passengers in your vehicle, and in this other case we're willing to overlook that. On line 223 through 226, it also states that a taxi cab cannot be used as a TNC vehicle. And I'm curious, through you, Madam Speaker, as to why that is included in the bill.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, we believe that a TNC and a taxi cab are two very different things. I know they do things that seem very similar. They drive people from point A to point B, but as the representative has pointed out several times, TNC drivers are independent contractors. They use a technology piece that's provided to them by a parent company to go out and drive folks around, but they are very different than a taxi cab. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. With respect to the chairman, those are not similar things, those are the same things. Both of these jobs pick up people at locations and drop them off at other locations. Again, line 227, the Commissioner of Transportation may adopt regulations. That appears in this bill numerous times, and I will remind everyone that the bill never went to the Transportation Committee. Section 4 starts with the language that has to do with background checks. So rather than ask a lot of questions, maybe I could just ask the chairman to describe to me the differences between the background check process for taxi drivers and TNCs. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, I will attempt to do that with brevity. Several years ago when I first introduced this bill, I actually went undercover, signed up to become an Uber driver, and decided that the background check process there was not stringent enough. That's why I originally introduced the first bill when I was first elected in 2015. The companies have come a long way since then, but with that said, I still feel that without a very clear regulatory structure like the one we are putting in place here when it comes to background checks, we are leaving our fellow citizens and our constituents exposed to potential problems when it comes to the folks that are picking them up and driving them somewhere when they presume that in doing so they're going to be safe. So what this basically says is that a TNC company is required to conduct a third-party background check, or they can fingerprint their employees and use the FBI database that is what taxicabs use to secure or to vet their folks that apply to be taxi drivers. What the background check does here in this bill is check all the various databases that are available to the companies, whether it's the sexual crime database, it's the state and federal court crime databases, all the databases that any employer would be using to look at a potential employee, and then giving that person a thumbs up or a thumbs down. The thumbs down in this instance comes from the fact that the person may or have been convicted of certain crimes. So in this bill, no driver is allowed to become an Uber or a Lyft driver or any TNC driver if they have more than 3 moving violations in the last 3 years, they've committed 1 serious traffic violation, or they had their license suspended. Moreover, no driver who in the last 7 years has been convicted of the following offenses: DUI, fraud, sex crimes, the use of a car for a felony, an act of terrorism. None of those folks will be allowed to drive. And if you were ever on the sex offender registry, you cannot drive. So what this bill does and Section 4 does is put forward a series of very common sense background check standards that if the company does vet the person using them, I believe we can safely look at our constituents in the eye and tell them that they are getting the most full, proper background check. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thanks to the chairman for his lengthy answer. What I was looking for, though, was the differences, really, between this background check requirement versus TNCs and taxicabs. And I would say the first thing that's noteworthy about it, and I am by no means an expert, I just looked at the state website for the requirements to become a taxi driver. But one thing I noticed right off the bat is that you have to be fingerprinted. And that is not the case here. You can just submit to what seems to me, and the chairman can correct me if I'm wrong, the same kind of background check you might get if you were going to try and rent an apartment. I question whether that is significant enough to authorize people to go out and pick up consumers and give them the feeling that they're indeed being looked out, by the state to make sure we're only allowing, people that meet certain criteria can do it. So I noticed this section seemed to expand between this version and the last one, so I'm having a little difficulty getting to where I'm looking, but the one piece, and here it is, it's on line 275. It talks about how far the look back is for certain crimes. And I thank the chairman for mentioning the things he did about, certain types of crimes, felonies, acts of violence, and so forth, fraud. Those things would preclude you from becoming a TNC driver if they show up on your background check. But they only go back 7 years. So through you, Madam Speaker, to the chairman, does this mean that if you were convicted of any of these crimes that were just listed, including DUI, alcohol, fraud, sexual offenses, use of a motor vehicle to commit a felony, acts of violence, or terror, and it is 7 years and a day ago, that you would, in fact, be allowed to still operate as a TNC driver? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, I apologize. I believe what the representative is asking me is why 7 years? And the answer to that is 7 years is the industry standard when it comes to background checks. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I don't doubt the chairman is correct that that is the industry standard for transportation network companies, but I'm quite certain it is not the industry standard for people in the industry of carrying people for a fee. I think that the threshold is probably much, much higher for people in other livery businesses. I noticed also on line 280 a very interesting statement that says, it's 280 and there's a big D there, and it says, does not possess a vehicle operator's license. So this made me think of something, which is that the mere requirement is that you don't have these things show up in your 7-year background check and you have a driver's license. Is there anything in this bill, Madam Speaker, and could I have a little help getting the room a little quieter? Thank you, Madam Speaker. Is there anything in this bill that precludes someone from being a TNC driver if they are not a lawful resident of the United States. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, I believe that in the background check process that would come about through this, that would be discovered that the person is not a U.S. citizen, but there's nothing that specifically prohibits a non-citizen from becoming an Uber driver. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I appreciate that, except I wasn't asking about citizens. I was asking about people lawfully in the country or not. This requirement simply says that you have not committed the crimes listed that have been discovered on the background check. I say that caveat because I think that's not necessarily going to be the most complete source of information. But it also says you would only be excluded if you did not possess a vehicle operator's license. But as we all know in this chamber, we have passed a law that allows people who are not lawfully in the country to have a driver's license. So I would just like for legislative intent to understand fully whether or not this bill allows people not lawfully in the United States to become Uber drivers. Through you, Madam Speaker, or TNC drivers.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, there is nothing in this bill that specifically does not allow what Representative Sampson is talking about. Through you.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thanks to the chairman. So I just would like to make sure that people understand that for the record. There is nothing that prohibits someone not lawfully in the country from being the person that picks you up the next time you use a TNC. The following section has to do with how we keep track of TNC drivers and their background going forward. And I found it pretty interesting because it seems to say in almost every case, we're relying on the driver to tell them. It says you shall report. So if this is a significant source of your income, being a TNC driver, how likely is it that when you get your fourth moving violation or your one serious traffic violation or your conviction for some major crime, that you're just going to volunteer that information to the TNC? I don't think it's likely at all. And I'd say that's a major concern that we ought to keep an eye on going forward. A follow-up to that, Madam Speaker, is there any penalty in the law that for a person that somehow does not report to the TNC that they are no longer eligible based on the background check? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, as in most industries throughout the state, I'm sure, the standard is the same, self-reporting of a crime, though there are subsequent background checks that would, of course, uncover this information, but we rely on the employee to tell the employer when they have done something that they know the employer would then dismiss them for. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thanks for that answer. But again, just to go back, we are not talking about employees and employers. We're talking about independent contractors, and we are not talking about the actual substantive background check. We're talking about a requirement for that independent contractor to notify the TNC. A little earlier, the chairman mentioned that there is, in fact, a policy requirement in this bill to say the TNCs must put together a policy to confront drivers that they're associated with when they fail to comply with some of the requirements. And I appreciate that. And that is contained in lines 314 to 322. I would just say that my concern with this is it's pretty one-sided. And maybe that's to the benefit of the consumer, but it's certainly not to the benefit of the TNC driver, because it essentially says that the moment someone makes a complaint against you, you are suspended. I think it's interesting that we are putting that as a requirement in our law, and that's not just a policy adopted by that private company. And I also think that somehow it could be tested in court, because I don't think that we often require companies to adopt policies to consider people guilty until proven innocent, or to be punished by that company as a requirement of a policy we told them they had to adopt. I'll just go on and repeat that in section 332 through 342, previously we had talked about the requirements on the TNC company, but this is also speaking directly to the TNC driver themselves, that they must comply with this requirement to not discriminate based on destination. As I said before, I don't see how this could possibly work in a case where the driver is going to know that information in advance, and there is no way for anyone to know whether or not that's the purpose or reason why they would deny to pick up a fare. A little farther down in that same section, on line 344, it prohibits a TNC driver from soliciting or accepting a request for transportation outside of the TNC network. So I just have a question on this, Madam Speaker, and that is, for legislative intent, does this apply all of the time, or does it only apply when the app is on? And another question would be, is there anything precluding any TNC driver from working for more than one TNC company? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, I just want to go back to the representative's last point, which was that how would a person know that somebody was going to be have some sort of disability or have some sort of characteristic as a human being that would invite discrimination. What that's trying to get out is that somebody, in the case of somebody who has a wheelchair, they have to have, in this bill, the ability to denote the fact that they need a wheelchair accessible car. But let's say that for a second on this section 332 through 342, somebody did have a service dog, and somebody called an Uber, they requested an Uber, and then they pulled up on the curb.
Point of order, Madam Speaker. This is not the question that I asked. I was asking about something entirely different, which was about...
Excuse me, this chamber will stand at ease for a moment. Chamber will come back to order. Representative Sampson, I believe you were speaking.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. The question I had asked was specifically about whether or not this section, lines 344 to 346, precluded someone from picking up a passenger in their vehicle ever, unless they were, in fact, working for the TNC company at the time. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, no, it does not.
I'm sorry. Representative Scanlon. Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So that's pretty clear here, that if you are working for a TNC company, they expect you to do the TNC rides through them. However, I have some concerns about this language because I think it may expand beyond the time that you're actually working for the TNC company, and it might also interfere with things like picking up a passenger that you are friendly with while you're on the clock for whatever reason. And how long is someone considered a TNC driver for? If I have an app with a TNC company today and I use it once or twice, but I don't use it again for a couple of years, and then, of course, something happens, am I still considered a subcontractor of that TNC company? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, if the gentleman can please rephrase his question, I would appreciate it.
Representative Sampson, would you be so kind as to rephrase your question, please?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I will, I'll just choose not to ask the question and point out that the language in 344 through 346 I think is poorly written and creates problems because it says that you cannot solicit or accept a request for transportation unless it's accepted through the TNC. There is no other caveats in there about whether the app should be on or off or how long you've been in contact with the TNC or not, and I think it needs to be corrected. The next part of the bill has to do with TNC vehicles, which essentially are the vehicles owned by average citizens operating as TNC drivers. And there is a requirement that the vehicle cannot be more than 12 years old and that cannot be designed to carry more than 8 passengers. The thing that I find interesting is that in lines 364 through 367 and on past that, it lists the requirement for a TNC vehicle. And what it's essentially doing is requiring the driver to certify that the vehicle is in good working order. This is not an inspection required by motor vehicles or by some authority or by someone knowledgeable in the working order of a motor vehicle. I'm sure Representative Scanlon and I can tell whether the headlights are working and the wipers work, but I don't know that we can identify whether or not our airbags are in good working order just by looking at our car. And we are essentially saying in this bill that is satisfactory to allow people to get into a stranger's vehicle who is operating as a driver for a TNC. Is there any other protection, through you, Madam Speaker, to consumers to make sure that the TNC vehicle that's being operated is indeed safe, has working airbags, and so on? Through you, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, the bill, as the representative does correctly state, does require them to certify that this is done. It does not say that they cannot do that at a licensed dealership. Doesn't say that they can't do that or they won't do that at their local auto body store. It just says that they have to certify it and the TNC is reliable. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'll just point out for the benefit of anyone listening that I don't think that that's satisfactory. I am certain that folks in the taxicab and livery industry, because they are carrying passengers, citizens of our state, have to submit to certain types of vehicle inspections to make sure that their vehicles are in working order and they are safe. And here is another difference where we are allowing these vehicles on the road without those requirements. And the suggestion that the owner of the vehicle, the TNC driver, is qualified to certify that the vehicle is safe and the airbags are working and so forth, to me, is a stretch. I don't think it's satisfactory. So we'll move on to Section 5, which is about, finally, we get to the topic of insurance. As I mentioned, I'm the ranking member of the Insurance Committee, and when this bill came before us, this was the subject matter we were most concerned with. And as such, I have the fewest questions on this part of the bill. I'll just say for the record that what it does is it says that when a TNC driver has their application on, they are required to have a certain amount of insurance, but it's made very clear in the bill that the TNC company is going to provide coverage in the case that they do not from the first dollar, at the amounts of $50,000 per person, $100,000 per accident for bodily injury liability, and $25,000 for property damage liability. Once that TNC driver picks up a rider, the coverage increases dramatically. And again, it would be the TNC company itself that is responsible from the first dollar up to $1 million. I do have a question though, and that is on line 390, there is a mention of uninsured motorist coverage. And from what I can gather from the language in the bill, it simply omits any requirement for uninsured motorist coverage for the TNC driver other than what the law currently is. So through you, Madam Speaker, if the good chairman can tell me what is implied or what 390 and 391 means with respect to the driver's uninsured motorist insurance and whether they will have any if the app is on or off. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, the good representative's interpretation that was leading up to that question is accurate. Through you.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I have one concern here, but I think it's a pretty important concern, and that is because the TNC company has agreed to take care of the liability portion of the policy from the first dollar when the app is on and also when there is a rider. But they have not specified that they would provide any coverage for UM. Does that mean if the person's private insurance carrier precludes coverage when this is underway, that they do not have UM coverage? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, that is correct. Through you.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I will leave that as it be. In section 421, it says that the transportation network company can choose to purchase their insurance in either one, an insurance company authorized to do business in the state, or two, a surplus lines insurer, which by definition is a company not licensed to do insurance in the state. So I thought that was rather interesting. But I'll point out that I think it's odd that we would allow a non-admitted carrier to provide the coverage in this particular case. In lines 429 and so on, it says that the TNC driver shall carry proof of insurance satisfying the required coverage under coverage A. And my question for the chairman is simply, how would they provide that proof of insurance if that insurance is coming from the TNC company? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, the TNC company is required to provide the driver with that information so that they can begin service as a driver on the TNC platform. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Would that information be provided in paper or electronically so that maybe they could show it on their phone as part of the application? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, as the ranking member is aware, there is another bill that is still alive here in this chamber that would allow for the use of electronic insurance in terms of proof of insurance. But because we had not passed that bill and it was unclear whether we will pass that bill this session, we removed the piece of this bill that did pass our committee, which would have allowed the TNC to use electronic insurance. So now that that's out of the bill, they would have to use actual hard copy insurance because that is the law of the state. So when it says that that's what they have to do, it means a hard copy. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I really appreciate the chairman spelling that out because I don't think it's clear from the language in the bill that it has to be a written document, and I appreciate that clarification. In lines 445 through 450, it talks about a potential claims investigation, and it says that the TNC has to provide information to law enforcement about any accidents, that kind of thing that occurs for the 12-hour periods prior to and after the accident. And I would just note that since we say elsewhere in the bill that we allow TNC drivers to operate for a maximum of 14 hours, that is something that I think should be revisited and corrected, because you could easily be showing that someone was beyond their 14 hours, but we're not catching that with this 12 hours before and after issue. The next section basically says that it is perfectly okay in Connecticut for personal automobile insurance carriers to exclude coverage when people are operating as TNC drivers. I mentioned the uninsured motorist insurance a few minutes ago, and to me that is a pretty important concern. But lines 514 through 517 are regarding comprehensive and collision coverage. And I think it's interesting to note that it says here that if the private insurance company is essentially turning off your insurance that you have purchased through them when you're operating as a TNC driver, and the TNC is picking up your exposure to liability, who is protecting the collision coverage of your vehicle and also the potential lien holder in that case? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, my understanding is that the company is doing that. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
I'm sorry, Madam Speaker. I was a little distracted. I didn't hear the chairman's answer.
Representative Scanlon, would you care to repeat your answer, please?
For sure. Through you, Madam Speaker, I said the company. Through you.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So for legislative intent, the chairman is indicating that the TNC would provide coverage for the comprehensive and collision to a TNC driver's automobile while the app is on because their personal insurance would not be active. Is that correct through you, Madam Speaker? Representative
Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, yes, that is my understanding. Through you.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm hoping that the chairman can point that out to me in the bill because I think it's pretty explicit in lines 514 through 517 that that is not the case.
Representative Sampson, is there a question in there?
I have asked the good chairman if he would be so kind to point out to me in the bill where it shows that the TNC company is providing comprehensive and collision coverage for the TNC driver's vehicle when the app is on because their personal automobile liability insurance company may not be providing it. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, sir, for repeating that. Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, in reading those lines, I don't see anything to cite the contrary. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Forgive me, this is just another symptom of looking at the bill in less detail with less time than I would have liked. But I do appreciate the chairman's indication for legislative intent that that would be, in fact, covered, although I still don't see it in the language. The good news is we're almost to the end of the language in the bill and to the end of my questions. In section 11, which is on page 20 of the 24-page bill, so people know how close we are to the end here, I'll just note that this language applies mostly to taxi industry folks, and essentially it says that the Commissioner of Transportation essentially sets a lot of guidelines and rules and requirements for those in the taxi industry, including the rates that they charge for picking people up and carrying them and so forth. And it makes it pretty explicit that it applies only to taxi cabs and that in no way, shape, or form should a TNC company, rider, potential rider, driver, or vehicle have anything to do with the regulations on taxis. I will just ask one final question, I guess, and that is if the chairman would be so kind to explain section 13 of the bill to me. From what I'm reading, it seems to create a study that would give the Commissioner of Transportation some authority to examine how TNCs and taxis could be best used in this state to help various state agencies and folks with disabilities, Medicaid recipients, and so forth. Am I reading that correctly? And can you tell me any more detail about how this ended up in the bill and what it has as far as relevance to the TNC regulation construct that the bill is about? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Madam Speaker, absolutely. And several times during our discussion here, the good ranking member has alluded to the fact that he was not sure whether this bill went further enough in terms of prosecuting or sanctioning a driver or an entity that was in fact committing acts of discrimination against a potential customer. This bill, or this section 13 of the bill rather, simply tries to determine whether or not this bill does go far enough. And if it doesn't go far enough, then we would perhaps come back here as a legislative body to address some of the concerns that my friend Representative Sampson has raised about whether this bill could do more to ensure that discrimination is not happening, and that is what this bill, or this section rather, is about. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I will thank the chairman for his patience and all of his answers this afternoon. I am done asking questions, so if you need to take a break, Representative, you are welcome to. I will just wrap up very briefly to say that I was excited to hear about the various TNC companies entering our marketplace, and I still am. I think that technology is an amazing thing. I am the last person to ever want to stifle the advances in our technology and new entrepreneurs from starting businesses and having great ideas to move us forward. And I will stand by that. And we've had some legislation in this chamber over the last several years that does the exact opposite. We have tried to protect certain industries in some cases, and that's a noteworthy endeavor also. Here we are faced with this situation where we are kind of trying to do both at the same time, and that is a very, very difficult thing to do. The taxi industry is a long-standing industry in our state. They have performed a valuable service over time. We have the TNC companies, which is a new invention that does a very similar, and I would go back to saying maybe the same thing, but in a different way. And as a result, it's very difficult for us to come up with a mechanism that is fair to that industry and also fair to a new industry coming into our state. The thing that I would say is the greatest inhibitor of doing that successfully is trying to do too much. You know, we have other bills that we're going to be faced with. We have bills about the electric car industry versus the existing automobile dealer situation. It's a similar case where we have a regulatory environment that someone does not want to comply with because they claim, and maybe rightfully so, that their industry is different. This is the same thing. And the one thing I can point to is that because we have created such a deep and intertwined regulatory system for this, it becomes very difficult to untangle it for folks. And I would urge that we try and do the very least possible in regulating these types of industries to allow for new ideas and innovation and to prohibit us from making mistakes that might be damaging to one industry or another. I have some concerns about this bill. You can't have listened to the last, bit of conversation without realizing that there are certain things which may or may not, based on your opinion, concern you. We talked about the very, very high cost of a license to get engaged in this business, $50,000, potentially non-refundable. To me, that's a barrier to entry. We wouldn't say that to someone who wanted to become an insurance agent or a real estate agent or a plumber, electrician, anything. I don't know an industry where we charge such a high amount for a license to begin operating in our state. I see this as a mechanism only to prevent other small companies from getting involved, and I have a big problem with it. We learned that there are some potential concerns about the photo and decal requirements because there's no mechanism really to ensure that these things are happening. Certainly the TNC company wants to see them too. I have no doubt that they will try and self-police the drivers that they contract with, but at the same time, our primary focus has to be the protection of citizens and consumers in our state. And I'm afraid that part leaves some holes where that may not be happening. There is this restriction on cash payments, which I don't know is even lawful. There are the differences in this bill from how we are going to treat the TNC industry from the taxi industry that are very noteworthy. We are telling one what the prices are that they have to charge, while we are giving the other one full reign, except for in certain very specific situations. We are treating them the same in theory, but not the same in other things, though, like the requirement that they would have to travel to any destination. I have already expressed during the conversation that I think that the language in the bill will not end up ensuring that TNC drivers will in fact do what is prescribed in this language because there's no mechanism to make them do it. And that may in fact be a good thing because I don't know that every TNC driver who may just be a very young college-age kid. We didn't get into this, but I don't even know what the requirement is other than having a driver's license. You may be 16, 17 years old and be able to be a TNC driver. To send that person into a potentially dangerous environment, I don't think is a good idea, versus a professional who is gone through a different licensing process, a more extensive background check, and has, I would hope, have had some training to do so. We talked about the different requirement in the driver's licenses. We talked about the difference in the background checks, which I think is noteworthy. We talked about the, again, self-policing requirement for the TNCs. I'm just breezing through the bill just to make sure that we kind of remind ourselves before we vote of the things that are important. I guess that more or less covers the concerns that I have brought out in the question and answer. And I hope that people understand that the purpose of this was not as a means to say anything negative about the bill. I merely want people to understand the facts before we vote on it, because it's important what we are doing. And I want to make sure that we are very thoughtful before we potentially put any lives in danger with policy that we make. And I would urge my colleagues to give great thought to all of these concerns before they make their vote. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, sir. Will you